Thank you very much, Peters, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to see so many old friends. The topic of diasporas and mobility is a very close to my heart, not only for professional but also for personal reasons. As Peters mentioned, I grew up as a member of the Latvian diaspora. I know the difficulties of maintaining ties with your homeland while you're integrating in your host country. I experienced transatlantic mobility, then intra-EU mobility. I moved from the US to Latvia right after independence, and I lived and worked here for almost 20 years before moving with my family to France 3 years ago, to Strasbourg, although my true home is in Frankfurt Airport. But I watched my kids struggle to integrate in France with French and then succeed. As Commissioner for Human Rights, I've examined issues relating to migration, asylum, and human rights in many, many countries over the last 3 years, in Austria, Bulgaria, Denmark, France, Greece, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Turkey, and most recently in Germany last week. It's true, most of the time I deal with migration and asylum from outside the EU into EU countries. I've looked at issues such as pushbacks at land and sea borders, detention and criminalization of irregular migrants in many countries, problems in asylum procedures and in integrating after people receive some kind of status, ignoring the best interest of the child in asylum and migration processes. But I've also examined certain issues pertaining to intra-EU mobility, freedom of movement, and the consequences in both sending and receiving countries. For example, in Romania, I looked at the rights of children who are left behind by migrating parents. And the figures there are quite striking. They're less now than they were immediately after EU accession, but they're still quite significant. At the end of 2013, there were more than 80,000 children with at least one parent abroad working elsewhere in the EU, where many moved right after accession. It's a big issue in Latvia as well, of course. Some of my colleagues in the academic world called them Euro orphans. I just heard from somebody in the European Commission, they really hate this term, Euro orphans. But I think it's a real issue. Children who are left behind by parents, often with grandparents. Parents rarely inform the authorities about leaving. And while the children often benefit from remittances, they suffer profound emotional consequences by not having their parents around, and there's a much higher risk of ending up in institutions or being neglected. However, the most common two issues that I've examined in my country work related to the topics you're looking at here are controversies over intra-EU Roma migration and the broader racism and hostility to arrivals from new EU member states in general. Let me start with the Roma. As I'm sure you all know, Roma are among the most excluded minorities in Europe. Many live in abject poverty. They face systematic discrimination in the labor market, in housing, education, health. According to research by the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU, they're the most common victims of discrimination and hate crimes and hate speech in EU countries. And many have sought to flee poor conditions in new EU member states by migrating to Western Europe, where they're often not very welcome at all. I was told by the German Minister for Labor and Social Affairs last week that there are 160,000 Roma of Romanian and Bulgarian origin in Germany. Quite a big figure. I have not had the chance to verify it. And despite some rhetoric about so-called benefit tourism, she affirmed that these migrants are net contributors to the German budget, that they are not sponging off the German budget, that they actually, most of them work, and the ones who work support the ones who don't work. Germany has dealt relatively well with this influx from Bulgaria and Romania, and I'm trying to understand why. I think it's a combination of a good social safety net and many old industrial cities with spare housing in which they have moved these people relatively rapidly. And there are few, if any, shanty towns. Every German official I talked to said this could not exist. This is not the case in France. We just published a report not too long ago on France, in which one of the issues we looked at was the situation of Roma migrants. France has 10 times fewer Roma migrants, between 15 and 20,000, primarily from Romania and Bulgaria. But anybody who's looked into this issue in France knows that every major city has a shanty town near it, composed primarily of Roma. I visited some of these shanty towns on the outskirts of Marseille, even in Strasbourg, one of the capitals of Europe. They're pretty nasty places to live. I've never seen such big rats as the ones I saw in Marseille. And very often, the local authorities are not doing enough to help them. A lot of anti-Gypsyism and hostility was also noted in France in various areas, including political rhetoric, stigmatizing Roma, especially around election times, really biased media coverage, violent attacks, police violence, especially during frequent evictions. Roma are evicted, or have been evicted in the past, from their settlements very often, but it doesn't matter, they set up new shanty towns right afterwards. I've urged not only France, but many other countries to stop these evictions. They are not doing any good. They disrupt the schooling of children, any progress and integration that has been made. They traumatize those who are affected, and it's not a durable solution. What we need is to consult with the Roma to find durable solutions, to give them access to social housing, other kinds of housing, employment, and so on. This can work. I visited a very interesting project in Strasbourg where 130 Roma live in kind of transitional housing in campers provided by the local authorities. Initially, I thought, why campers? Pretty suspicious. Sounds like a stereotypical approach to Roma. It was explained to me that they could not have permanent housing because of zoning right there. But it seemed to work relatively well because they have a lot of social assistance, and all the children were in school. This was a major step forward. And a number of the people had full-time jobs or apprenticeships. And so it can work. Pilot research in the United Kingdom has shown that Roma, who are previously in special schools, so-called special schools in Slovakia and the Czech Republic, did very well in mainstream education in the UK because they received the necessary support from teachers and staff, and they did not face the kind of hostility that they faced back home. But Roma are a subset of a broader flow of people from Central and Eastern Europe westward after EU enlargement in 2004 and 2007. I think the scale of this movement caught many people by surprise, certainly caught the British political elite by surprise, and led to a racist reaction in some quarters. We all know the legend of the Polish plumber in France and Poland's witty response with the posters of the sexy Polish plumber saying, "Come on, I'm ready to come and fix your pipes." The nasty website created by Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, where people were invited to complain about the nasty East Europeans and their misbehavior. The media in Latvia after EU accession was full of stories about people in Ireland and the UK and their difficulties and some of the reaction that they encountered. But more recently, we've encountered controversies about so-called benefit tourism or benefit profiteers. And I have a feeling that this debate is going to heat up in the UK after the elections. I already mentioned Germany. We've seen it in the UK, but also in Switzerland, which is not an EU member state. But what has happened in Switzerland has echoed within the EU. In Switzerland, as you probably know, they had a referendum on quotas for migrants from the EU, and this Swiss vote was echoed very much in political circles in France, in Austria, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. The debate is often racist and should be countered by politicians, by media, business, and civil society. In some cases and some jurisdictions, it can even be prosecuted under hate speech laws. More often, I've called for self-regulation on the part of politicians and the media to avoid creating migration panics, avoid using metaphors of invasions and floods and sinking ships, and avoid the racialization of this debate. I think most of all we need to inject empirical evidence into this debate. And there's a lot of good research, and I'm very pleased that there are so many academics in this room today. I have invoked research from University College London on the fiscal consequences of migration to the UK from 8 Central and East European member states that joined in 2004. It shows that new migrants from other EU countries are 60% less likely to claim benefits or tax credits compared to natives, and 58% less likely to live in social housing. So in other words, they are not sponging off the system in any way. And each year, in recent years, migrants made a positive contribution to the public finances because they have a high labor market participation rate. They paid more in indirect taxes and made lower use of benefits and public services. I've also seen research in Sweden on the consequences of migration from Bulgaria and Romania. It also found a net fiscal contribution of migrants. The German Minister of Labor and Social Affairs claims that this is the case in Germany as well, and she promised to send me research on this in the coming days and weeks. So in other words, benefits tourism is a myth. It's a racist one at that we should combat because I think it really hinders intra-EU mobility and will be invoked often by those who want to put all kinds of barriers in the place of mobility. Unfortunately, myths are often very durable. They're sustained by populist parties, by the tabloid media, and I think we need to communicate much better. We need to communicate the right to be free of discrimination, to equality before the law, to be treated with dignity. And we need also to focus on the hard demographic and economic facts that many EU countries need migration. They might not want to admit it, but they need it. This was an interesting thing in the German debate. I was told that industry has been very active in lobbying a liberalization of laws pertaining access to the labor market, pertaining access to apprenticeships, and that politicians listened to those who are donating to their political campaigns. And I think we also need to communicate that the experience until now in the receiving states has been primarily a very positive one in terms of the economic effects. It could be more positive on the political, social, and cultural dimensions if opinion leaders were to take a lead and an approach based not only on economic rationality, but also on human rights values. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
The Commissioner has agreed for a few questions.
Good afternoon and welcome to the final session. But before we start this final session, I'd like to ask the audience if anyone has a question for the Commissioner. Yes, so. This is the moment I need to put my glasses on. There we go.
Hi, my name is Samia Badani. I'm from New-Europeans in the UK. Last year, a UK minister said that cities in the UK were swamped by EU migrants. And all that happened to him was he did apologize at the end, but that was about it. My question is that we are concerned in the UK that the government wants to get rid of the Human Rights Act. And I want to know what your advice would be, what you think, or what support we can get, because we hold dearly the values of equalities, and it's quite scary for us.
Well, I mean, the debate in the UK, we've been watching it with concern from the Council of Europe for some time, and especially the proposals to replace the UK Human Rights Act with something else, and all proposals to make the European Court of Human Rights an advisory body. I have argued in a memo I submitted to the UK Parliament that this will be the beginning of the end of the system. If countries are allowed to say that judgment is obligatory and this one is advisory, if the UK does this, imagine what other countries are going to do. That will lead to the destruction of the system. The interesting thing about the debate in the UK about Europe is that very often, at least in Westminster, I have not seen a recognition that the debate about membership in the EU and the Council of Europe is in any way linked to the constitutional setup of the country. But if you go to Northern Ireland and to Scotland, you hear a very different voice. You hear the Scots and the people in Northern Ireland saying, there's no way they're going to do this without us. There's no way they can amend the Human Rights Act or change our relations with Brussels or Strasbourg without consulting us. And the Act on Devolution and the Good Friday Agreement both have the European Convention embedded in them. So if you try to revisit the UK's relationship with the European Convention, I don't want to make any predictions, but I think it will complicate the life of politicians in Westminster and their attempts to find a good working relationship with others. So the debate has gone in a bad direction in the last several years, and I have a feeling it's only going to get worse, which will require a lot of intervention on my part and the part of others. But I find it very regrettable because there's so few cases against the UK in the European Court of Human Rights that it shouldn't really be an issue, but it is. And I think we will have to work hard to keep the voice of Europe alive in the UK. But the UK is, as you might imagine, is only one of many headaches that we have. And not the most severe one.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you also for your time today. I think we need to move on to the final panel, but very much appreciated your